Before we talk about who you're becoming, we need to talk honestly about who has to disappear. There was a version of you, maybe for years, maybe for as long as you can remember, who believed that love meant staying reachable no matter the cost, who apologized before boundaries even finished leaving your mouth, who explained and re-explained and softened every no into something palatable enough that it wouldn't cause discomfort in someone who had already caused you plenty. That version of you did not fail. She simply reached the end of what she was built to survive. It's worth understanding where that warmth actually came from, because it wasn't weakness, and it certainly wasn't naivety. Developmental psychology gives us a clear picture here. Many empaths were shaped in environments where love had to be earned through attunement, where being agreeable, accommodating, endlessly understanding was the price of staying safe, staying wanted, staying connected. Gabor Mate has written extensively about this, the way children adapt to their environment by suppressing authentic needs in favor of whatever keeps the relationship intact. That adaptation doesn't disappear in adulthood. It just finds new relationships to repeat itself in. So when we talk about the death of the warm empath, we're not talking about the death of compassion itself. We're talking about the death of a specific, exhausted pattern. The belief that your worth is measured by how much you can absorb, excuse, and remain available for, regardless of what it costs you internally. That belief had to die, because it was never sustainable, and more importantly, it was never actually love. It was a survival strategy, wearing love's clothing. There's a concept in psychology called the false self, developed by Donald Winnicott, describing a protective outer identity built to manage an unsafe environment. The endlessly warm, endlessly reachable empath is often, whether she realizes it or not, a false self. Not fake in the sense of dishonest, but constructed, built for a specific purpose, keeping the peace, avoiding conflict, staying needed. And like any structure built for survival rather than authenticity, it eventually becomes unsustainable the moment the person underneath it starts waking up. This is where the shedding begins. And I want to be honest with you about what shedding actually feels like, because it rarely feels like empowerment in the moment. It feels like grief. It feels like disorientation. You start setting a boundary, and your whole body braces for the abandonment that boundaries used to invite. You start choosing yourself, and some old, familiar voice whispers that you're becoming cold, becoming difficult, becoming someone unrecognizable. That voice isn't wrong that you're changing. It's wrong about what the change means. What's actually happening is closer to what Carl Jung called individuation, the long, often uncomfortable process of becoming a fully differentiated self, separate from the roles and expectations that once defined you. You are not losing your empathy, you are losing the version of empathy that had no boundaries, no discernment, no protection. And that version had to go because it was never going to lead you anywhere except right back to the same depletion, the same people, the same cycle. This isn't a loss you need to apologize for. The warm, boundaryless version of you kept you safe for as long as she could. Now it's time to let her rest, so someone stronger can finally step forward. There's a word people love to use when an empath finally stops giving so freely, and that word is cold. It gets said with a certain accusatory weight, as though withholding warmth from someone who abused it is a character flaw rather than a corrective. But I want to challenge that framing directly, because what looks like coldness from the outside is very rarely coldness at all. It's calibration, and calibration is one of the most sophisticated psychological skills a person can develop. To understand this shift, you have to understand what the old pattern actually was. For years, your warmth operated without a filter. It didn't ask whether someone had earned access to it. It didn't check whether the relationship was reciprocal, safe, or even respectful. It simply activated, automatically, the moment someone expressed need, regardless of who they were or what they'd already done to you. That isn't compassion in its healthiest form. That's an unregulated nervous system responding to old survival conditioning, giving because giving once felt like the only way to stay safe or valued. What you're doing now, becoming more selective, more discerning, less automatically available, is not the opposite of compassion. It's compassion finally being paired with judgment, which is what it needed the entire time. Aristotle wrote about virtue as the mean between two extremes. Courage sitting between recklessness and cowardice. Generosity sitting between excess and stinginess. Applying that same logic here, Healthy empathy sits between total emotional unavailability and total emotional exposure. The old you lived at one extreme. What people are calling coldness is actually you finally finding the mean. This distinction matters because of what it reveals about where your energy was actually going. Every time you extended warmth to someone who consistently disrespected, manipulated, or drained you, that warmth wasn't disappearing into the void. It was being redirected away from people and situations that deserved it more, including yourself. Withholding warmth from someone who has proven unsafe isn't cruelty. It's redirection. It's the recognition that your emotional resources are finite, and finite resources require decisions about where they go. There's a psychological concept worth naming here, something behavioral scientists call selective reinforcement. When you remain warm and available regardless of how you're treated, you are, whether you intend to or not, reinforcing the exact behavior that hurt you. The person learns there's no cost to mistreating you because the warmth keeps flowing anyway. When you finally calibrate, when warmth becomes conditional on safety and respect, you're not punishing anyone. You're simply removing a reinforcement pattern that was never serving you or, frankly, them. This is the part that often gets missed in conversations about boundaries. Withholding isn't the absence of love. In many cases, it's what makes love sustainable at all. A love with no boundaries, no discernment, no protection eventually collapses under its own weight, because it has no structure holding it up. A love that knows when to withhold, when to pause, when to require proof of safety before extending itself further. That's a love built to last, because it isn't bleeding out in every direction at once. You didn't become cold, you became precise and precision. Unlike unconditional warmth given to everyone regardless of what they've earned, is what finally lets your compassion survive every. Every person who ever hurt you learned something about Camillo they thought they could rely on forever. They learned what your face did when you were panicking. They learned how quickly you'd apologize just to end a conflict. They learned that if they pushed hard enough, long enough, you would eventually break your own boundary just to restore the peace. That knowledge became their playbook. And for a long time, it worked, because you were, understandably, reactive. Now it doesn't work anymore, and the reason is calm. I want to be precise about what calm actually means here, because it's often misunderstood as passivity or suppression. It's neither. Calm, in this context, is regulation. It's a nervous system that has learned, often through significant work, to stay grounded even when someone is actively trying to destabilize it. And to understand why this is so disarming to the people who once controlled you, you have to understand what they were actually trained on. Behavioral conditioning depends on predictable responses. For years, your reactivity was the predictable response they engineered and relied on. Raise the tension, and you'd panic. Withdraw affection, and you'd chase. Create a crisis, and you'd drop everything to manage it. Every manipulative dynamic depends on this kind of reliable lever pulling. Provoke a specific reaction, get a specific result. This is precisely why your calm is so disruptive. It's not that you stopped feeling things. It's that you stopped performing the reaction they were fishing for. There's a concept from polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, that explains this on a physiological level. Our nervous systems are constantly scanning for cues of safety or threat, and historically, yours may have been wired to interpret someone else's dysregulation as an emergency requiring your immediate management. What you've done through nervous system work, through boundaries, through simply refusing to engage the old pattern, is retrain that response. You've built what Porges would call a more resilient window of tolerance, the capacity to stay present and grounded even when someone is trying to provoke a reaction. This is where calm becomes something closer to strategic advantage than emotional suppression. When you no longer react the way you used to, the person attempting to provoke you loses their map. They don't know what to do with someone who witnesses their attempt at chaos and simply doesn't take the bait. Chase Hughes has spoken about how predictability is the foundation of behavioral control, and unpredictable calm, calm that doesn't match the expected script, is one of the most disorienting things a manipulator can encounter, because it removes every variable they were counting on to maintain control. What's important to understand is that this calm isn't coldness toward your own emotions. You still feel the provocation. You still notice the manipulation. The difference is that you've separated feeling from reacting. which is one of the most sophisticated psychological skills a person can develop. You process internally instead of performing externally. And that internal processing gives you something you never had before, the ability to choose your response rather than being hijacked into one. They spent years learning how to make you react. What they never prepared for was a version of you who simply didn't need to react at all. That stillness isn't the absence of power. It's the most complete expression of it you've ever had known. There's a fear that often surfaces right around this stage of the transformation. Quiet but persistent, whispering that becoming unreachable means becoming alone. That if you stop being infinitely available, if you stop answering every call for help, regardless of the hour or the cost, you'll end up isolated, disconnected, cut off from the very relationships that once gave your life meaning. I want to address that fear directly because it's built on a false equation. Unreachable was never meant to mean isolated. It means something far more precise and far more powerful, selectively permeable. Think about what a cell membrane actually does in biology. It doesn't seal an organism off from the world entirely, and it doesn't let everything pass through indiscriminately either. It filters. It allows nutrients in and keeps toxins out, constantly discerning what serves the organism and what threatens it. A healthy psychological boundary functions the same way. It isn't a wall. It's a membrane, intelligent, adaptive, and selective about what gets access to your inner world. For most of your life, that membrane may not have existed in any functional way. Anyone who claimed to need you got immediate, unfiltered access, regardless of whether they'd earned trust, regardless of whether the relationship was safe, regardless of what it cost you to keep the door open that wide. This isn't a personal failing. It often develops, as attachment theorists like John Bowlby and later researchers have shown, from early relational patterns where love felt conditional on your constant availability. But availability without discernment isn't connection, it's exposure. What you're building now, this darker, calmer, more deliberate version of yourself, isn't withdrawing from connection. It's finally installing the filter that should have existed the entire time. You're not closing yourself off from the world. You're closing yourself off from access without earned trust. And those are fundamentally different things. One leads to isolation. The other leads to relationships with actual depth, because depth requires selectivity. A person who is reachable by everyone, at all times, for anything, never actually goes deep with anyone. They're too busy managing the surface with everyone at once. Martin Buber's distinction between the I-thou and I-it relationship becomes useful again here. When you were reachable by default, many of the people who had access to you were relating to you as an it, a resource, a function, something to extract comfort or support from without genuine mutual regard. True I-thou connection, the kind where two people meet each other fully, requires selectivity. It requires you to choose who gets that level of access, rather than distributing it indiscriminately to anyone who asks. This is why the people who once had unlimited access to you may now experience your boundaries as rejection. In a sense, they're right. They have been rejected from a level of intimacy they never actually earned. But the people who do earn access, who show up with honesty, consistency, and respect, will experience something they may never have gotten from you before. Your full presence, undiluted by the 15 other people also draining you dry at the same time. You are not becoming unreachable to the world. You are finally becoming reachable, fully, to the people who deserve it, and closed, permanently, to everyone who never did. No one arrives at cold, calm, and unreachable by accident, and certainly not by choice in the way people imagine. This transformation isn't a personality upgrade you decide to install one morning because it sounds appealing. It's forged, almost always, in the aftermath of something that broke you open first. Underneath this armor, if you look closely enough, there is grief. Real, unprocessed, often unacknowledged grief. For the version of you who gave everything and watched it go unprotected, unreciprocated, and nearly cost her everything in the process. This is worth sitting with honestly, because so much of the language around becoming cold and unreachable gets celebrated as pure empowerment, without acknowledging the loss underneath it. And that omission does you a disservice. Before this armor existed, there was a person who believed, genuinely and without cynicism, that her empathy was a gift the world would honor. She gave her attention, her patience, her emotional labor freely, trusting that this kind of generosity would be met with something resembling care in return. For many empaths, that trust gets broken repeatedly before the armor ever begins to form. Bessel van der Kolk's work on trauma reminds us that the body keeps a record of everything the mind tries to move past too quickly. Every time your empathy was exploited, every time your kindness was mistaken for weakness, every time you gave until there was nothing left and received nothing in return, that experience didn't just disappear once you moved on. It got stored, physiologically, as a lesson your nervous system was determined never to relearn the hard way again. The coldness, the calm, the unreachability, these aren't cosmetic changes. They're protective adaptations, built by a body and mind that decided, finally, enough was enough. This is where Carl Jung's concept of the shadow becomes relevant, though not in the way people often assume. The shadow isn't only the dark, hidden parts of ourselves we're ashamed of. Sometimes the shadow is the part of us we were never allowed to access, the boundaried self, the discerning self, the self who says no without apologizing for it. For many empaths, that shadow self stayed buried for years because expressing it felt like a betrayal of who they thought they were supposed to be. Endlessly warm, endlessly giving, endlessly available. The darkest upgrade, this cold and calm unreachability, is often that shadow finally being integrated, not suppressed. I want to be honest about something else too. This grief doesn't fully resolve just because the transformation is complete. There will be moments, quiet ones, where you miss the version of yourself who believed the best about everyone. You might grieve her optimism even while recognizing it nearly destroyed you. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. Healing was never about pretending the loss didn't happen. It was about surviving it with enough of yourself intact to build something sturdier from the wreckage. So if this upgrade sometimes feels less like triumph and more like mourning wearing a stronger face, that makes sense because that's exactly what it is. You are not celebrating the loss of your softness. You're honoring what it cost you to finally protect it. This armor was never meant to erase who you were. It exists because who you were deserved, finally, to be protected. There was a time when your compassion asked no questions. Someone in pain, regardless of who they were, regardless of what they'd done, regardless of whether they'd ever shown you the same care in return, received your full empathy by default. It didn't matter if they'd betrayed you the week before. It didn't matter if their pain was in part self-inflicted through choices that harmed you or others. Compassion simply activated, automatically, because that's what a good person does, or so you were taught to believe. That belief needed correcting, and this is where the correction happened. To understand why unconditional compassion, offered indiscriminately to anyone in pain, isn't actually the moral high ground people assume it to be, we have to look at what it costs the person extending it. When compassion has no conditions, no requirement for honesty, proximity, or mutual respect, it stops functioning as connection and starts functioning as extraction. You end up pouring care into people who have no intention of ever reciprocating it, simply because their pain, real or performed, was enough to activate your default setting. This isn't virtue. It's a vulnerability that predatory and manipulative people learn to exploit almost immediately. This is where a distinction becomes essential, the difference between compassion as a feeling and compassion as an action. You can feel genuine compassion for someone's suffering, even someone who has hurt you, even someone whose pain is largely self-created, without that feeling obligating you to act on their behalf. Buddhist philosophy actually supports this distinction clearly. Compassion, in its most developed form, isn't about self-sacrifice for anyone who suffers. It's about wishing beings free from suffering while maintaining clear discernment about your role, your capacity, and your boundaries in relation to that suffering. Feeling compassion and extending resources are not the same act, and conflating them is what exhausted you for years. What you're building now is compassion with a gate in front of it. Proximity matters. Is this someone actually in your life, actually accountable to you, or simply someone whose pain you've been conditioned to feel responsible for from a distance? Honesty matters. Is this person telling you the truth about their circumstances, or manipulating your empathy through a story engineered to bypass your discernment? Mutual respect matters. Has this person demonstrated, through consistent behavior, that they value you as much as they're now asking you to value their pain. When those conditions are met, your compassion flows as fully as it ever did. When they're not, it simply doesn't activate the way it used to, and that's not a loss. That's function returning to a system that was operating without any filter at all. There's something important to name here about how this shift gets perceived by people who benefited from your old, unconditional version. They will likely experience your new discernment as a betrayal of who you used to be, as though requiring honesty and respect before extending yourself is some kind of moral failure. It isn't. Aristotle understood virtue as requiring practical wisdom, not blind consistency. A compassion that cannot discern who deserves it isn't a stronger form of goodness. It's an unregulated one. You haven't lost your compassion. You've finally given it the conditions it always should have required, and in doing so, you've made sure it never runs dry again. Watch closely, and you'll notice something almost predictable about how people respond once you stop over-explaining, over-giving, and in over-functioning for relationships that never asked you to work that hard in the first place. The confusion arrives first. Then, often, the accusations. You've changed. You've gotten cold. You've become someone they don't recognize anymore. I want you to understand something clearly before we go any further. That reaction was never actually about you changing. It was about them losing access to a version of you that made their lives significantly easier. To understand this dynamic, you have to understand what role you were playing in these relationships without ever consciously agreeing to it. When you over-explain, you're doing someone else's emotional labor for them, managing their potential misunderstanding before it even happens. When you over-give, you're compensating for an imbalance that should have made someone else uncomfortable, not you. When you over-function, showing up, managing, fixing, absorbing consequences that were never yours to absorb, you're allowing someone else to underfunction, to remain comfortable in patterns that would otherwise have forced them to grow. This is where family systems theory becomes useful, particularly the work of Murray Bowen, who described how relationships often settle into a kind of functional equilibrium, where one person's over-functioning directly enables another person's under-functioning. It's not a coincidence, it's a system. And systems, by their nature, resist change, even change that's objectively healthy. When you step out of the over-functioning role, the entire system loses its previous balance. And the people who benefited most from that imbalance are usually the loudest voices calling your growth suspicious. This is worth naming plainly, because it can feel deeply disorienting when it happens. The people who called you too sensitive when you had boundaries and now call you too cold, when you enforce them, were never actually responding to your emotional state. They were responding to their loss of access and control. There is no version of you, soft or hardened, permissive or boundaried, that would have satisfied people who required your depletion in order to feel comfortable. Their discomfort isn't a referendum on your character. It's data about what they needed from you that you're no longer willing to provide. There's a concept from social psychology worth introducing here: cognitive dissonance. The discomfort people feel when new information contradicts a belief they've built their behavior around. For years, the people around you built a belief that you were endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly willing to absorb whatever they brought to you. Your growth doesn't just inconvenience them, it contradicts an entire internal narrative they've constructed about who you are and what you owe them. Rather than update that belief, which requires humility and self-reflection, it's far easier for them to conclude that you're the one who's changed for the worse. This is the part you need to hold on to when the accusations come, and they will come. Their confusion is not your responsibility to resolve. Their discomfort is not evidence that you did something wrong. It is, in fact, the clearest evidence available that the old dynamic no longer has any power over you. And that alone is worth every uncomfortable conversation it provokes. You didn't become someone they don't recognize. You simply stopped being someone they could use lefty. Let's return, finally, to something that needs to be said plainly, because it's the truth this entire transformation has been building toward. What you're witnessing in yourself right now, this colder, calmer, more discerning, more unreachable version of who you used to be, is not the death of your empathy. It never was. It's the most sophisticated form that empathy can take, the version that finally survives contact with the world instead of being consumed by it. I want you to consider what empathy looked like before this evolution. And I want you to be honest about it, without shame, but with clarity. It was reactive. It was indiscriminate. It activated for anyone, regardless of whether they'd earned it, regardless of what it cost you to give it, regardless of whether it was ever reciprocated. That version of empathy felt, at the time, like the purest expression of who you were. But an unprotected gift isn't purity. It's exposure. And exposure, sustained long enough, doesn't make you more compassionate. It makes you depleted, resentful, and eventually incapable of giving anything at all, because there's nothing left inside to give. This is where a broader psychological truth becomes essential to understand. Growth, real growth, rarely looks like becoming more of what you already were. It looks like integration, the process Carl Jung described as individuation, where fragmented, one-dimensional parts of the self get absorbed into a fuller, more complete whole. The old empath was one-dimensional, endlessly giving, without the counterbalance of discernment, boundaries, or self-protection. What you're becoming now isn't a departure from empathy. It's empathy finally integrated with wisdom, with judgment, with the hard-won understanding that giving without protection isn't sustainable generosity, it's slow self-destruction. There's something important to name about the word darkest in how we're framed this evolution throughout everything we've discussed. Darkness, in this context, was never about becoming a worse person. It was about descending into the parts of yourself you'd been taught to suppress. The anger, the discernment, the capacity to say no and mean it, and finally integrating them instead of exiling them. Jung called this shadow work for a reason. The shadow isn't evil. It's simply the disowned parts of the self, and disowned parts, left unintegrated, don't disappear. They either leak out in unhealthy ways or they wait, patiently, for the moment you're finally ready to reclaim them. This is the empath who survived. Not the one who disappeared under the weight of giving too much to people who gave nothing back. Not the one who hardened into permanent cynicism, closed off from connection entirely. The one who went through the fire of being used, exploited, and depleted, and came out the other side with her compassion intact, but finally protected by boundaries she should have had from the very beginning. This upgrade was never about becoming less than you were. It was about becoming complete. Someone whose empathy no longer requires her own destruction as the price of admission. You are not colder than you used to be. You are simply, for the first time, whole enough to protect the warmth you almost lost for good.